Today's meeting in Germany between Chancellor Angela Merkel and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. An encounter that could be described as a clash between Netanyahu's irresistible force trying to nix the Iran nuclear agreement and the until now immovable force of Merkel trying to preserve that deal.
I haven't changed my view of the JCPOA, but I think right now this is becoming a secondary question because the United States has left the deal. And I think the real question we have to confront today is what do we do about Iran's aggression? What do we do about Iran's remaining goals in its pursuit of nuclear weapons?
We, I think, are at one in saying we never want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. The question where we disagree is how do we achieve this goal? We think that JCPOA is a possibility to achieve that, at least for a certain period of time, to see to it that Iranian activities in that field are under control and prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. We also feel that in the aftermath, we need some kind of regulation. We also say we need to talk about their activities in Syria. But we think that through tough negotiations, through joint negotiations, this would be possible.
Polite ways to say we sort of disagree on most of what we're talking about. Joining us right here in the studio, Dr. Gisela. She's from the Center of German Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. But first, let's go to Washington. There, joining us, Dan Arbell, a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute, also a 25-year veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service. Dan, so Netanyahu obviously won his big fight. He got the United States, he got President Trump to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. Obviously, Europe is a very different audience for him. What do you think he can hope to achieve there?
Absolutely. Well, we saw in Berlin a display of the opposing views around JCPOA, around the Iran deal, with Israel calling on Europe, Germany, Britain, and France to pull out, while Europe has no intention of doing so. And so I think that this diplomatic dance would continue for a while. The European countries, the E3 as they're called, will continue to pursue a direction in which they can try and preserve the deal, at least between them and Iran. And Israel will do its utmost to try and sway them to pull out of the deal. I don't expect a resolution of this anytime soon.
Gisela, I want to ask you about a tactic that Netanyahu used today. He actually tried to, some might say, utilize or even exploit the Germany refugee crisis by saying that left unchecked, Iran's going to create more instability in Syria, and that will drive more Syrian refugees to countries like Germany. How is that kind of argument going to be received in Germany?
Well, I don't think that, I mean, on the one hand, it is clear that instability in the Middle East affects Europe more than ever, but I don't think that this will work on this strategy. I think Netanyahu, at the end of the day, had no illusions that suddenly Europe or Germany would change, or Merkel will change her mind. I think his strategy was to get his message through and thinking maybe, even if the accord will not be cancelled, maybe here and there it can be improved. I think that's straight ahead. And if one listens well, I mean, there is readiness among Europeans to see that there had been a few fault lines and maybe they can be improved. I think readiness that didn't exist before. But the gap still between cancelling the agreement or maintaining is very wide. But this was clear from the start.
Netanyahu heads off to France. He's going to meet with Macron next tonight, I believe. He's not going to get a very different reception there, is he? I mean, same mentality.
Macron wants to hear about the Russian-Israeli dialogue, knowing what's going on a little bit more in the Middle East from different perspectives. I think they probably... The refugee crisis is part of it. They feel they need to be involved more to know more about what's going on in the Middle East. Also, Macron won't change his strategy. What's interesting that for the first time after 7 months, Merkel today had given an answer to Macron's push for more Europe. And she was really making him wait for a long time. And maybe she chose her timing also on such a day, saying Europe has to stand closer together. Definitely not with the states. It's not clear how much it can be against, but let's say as something, some entity which is making its own policy as much as they could or can.
Well, Dan, let me follow up on that, because even though perhaps Chancellor Merkel wants Europe to stand unified, we do see some cracks in Europe, namely not between governments, but between European businesses, some of them, like Total Oil, already pulling out or threatening to pull out of deals in Iran, and some of their governments which are trying to keep them. Could it be that Netanyahu's real audience here is not Merkel, Macron, and May, but really the public or the business community, and he's trying to affect that internal argument?
I think that absolutely you've got a point there. He's definitely trying to send a message to the business community in Europe, to the publics in Europe, send a message that, you know, it's stay away from Iran. Iran is radioactive, so to speak. And so he's also, another point is that he's sending a message back home domestically. As we all know, Europe is not very, the EU especially, is not very popular in Israel. And so he's kind of flexing a muscle, showing the Europeans, you know, that he means business, showing him that he's aligned with Trump, and he's pushing to pull out of the JCPOA, calling to pull out of the JCPOA, while he does not truly expects these governments to pull out. But you are right about the publics and about businesses.
Dan, last month when President Trump announced he would pull out of the deal, the number one question people were asking is, what is the United States' plan B? What is their alternative? Well, Netanyahu has obviously been pushing for that. He's pushing for it now in Berlin. What do you think Netanyahu's alternative to the nuclear deal is?
I think that he's right behind the United States. It supports whatever policy, the increased sanctions, with increased pressure on Tehran, with secondary sanctions. And I think he'll be standing right behind the president and all that the president wants to achieve. It is, though, very unclear at this point what that plan B is. And perhaps Netanyahu does have a better sense of where the U.S. is heading. But I think that we're in this period of a 90 to 180-day period after the Trump decision to see how U.S. policy will play out. I think Israel will be right behind the U.S. in pushing that policy forward.
Gisela, briefly, realistically, can the Europeans pull out any kind of fix here, especially given even the Iranian attitudes?
Well, I think, again, that the question will be whether they can bring in missing points, and let's say the presence of Iranian troops in Syria, for example, to support the pullout of these kind of things. This is possible. I don't think that economically they won't pull out, and they don't want to pull out. And the political argument is saying they still think a bad agreement is better than no agreement. I think that's the bottom line also of Angela Merkel.
Well, as Dan mentioned, we're sort of on the clock to find out what they do, at least about sanctions. So we'll see by that deadline. Dr. Gisela Dax and Dan Arbell in Washington.